The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Welcome to the bonus show. The Steve King racism in Congress saga continues. The funniest thing about this entire fiasco is that all of a sudden people are realizing Steve King is racist when the guy has been saying horrible stuff since he's been in the House of Representatives. The latest is that after Steve King's racist remarks, it was announced that he would be kicked off of his committee assignments, and there are more calls for him to resign. House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy announced that Steve King is going to be removed from the House Republican Steering Committee, or rather, he is not going to be serving in any committees. Rather, the House Steering Committee decided that he's not going to be serving on any committees. There was also a vote taken about whether his comments are to be condemned. The answer was yes. Hilariously, Steve King voted in support of the House condemning his own comments and wrote them off as not stuff that he actually sincerely believes. And Mitt Romney, senator from Utah, a former governor of Massachusetts, has said that there's no place for Steve King in the House of Representatives and then he should resign. You know, Pat, that when even other Republicans like Mitt Romney are saying that the guy should go, it's very low-hanging fruit, and they would only do that if it was obvious that there was no political repercussion to being a Republican and calling for another Republican to resign. And it is time for King to go.
Yeah, and of course, Steve King's latest comments, and there have been many, this time he said, white nationalist, white supremacist, white Western civilization. How did that language become offensive? So that means that he's outraged that white supremacist as a term has become offensive. Okay. So I think if any other Republican had said this, you may be able to justify the case that they're not racist and they just had a slip of the tongue, a lapse in judgment, and you still condemn the comments, but you wouldn't necessarily conclude that they're racist. Steve King, on the other hand, has a long track record of this. He's talked about illegal immigrants coming across the border, smuggling drugs with cantaloupe calves. This is just the latest in a long string, and I think he should be removed from those committee assignments at the very least, maybe even ousted from Congress.
You know what's the most depressing element of this entire story? Our friend J.D. Scholten ran against Steve King in the 2018 midterms, and he lost, but narrowly. And J.D. Scholten was a great candidate. I got a chance to meet him, hang out a little, and interview him at Netroots Nation in New Orleans in August of 2018. And not only was J.D. Scholten a great candidate, he was running against someone who is one of the worst in the Republican Party in the House of Representatives. And by not that many votes, J.D. Scholten lost and Steve King was reelected. He may now end up having to step aside. We'll see if the pressure gets too big. We could have not even had to deal with this, Pat, if J.D. Scholten had gotten a few more votes and had ousted Steve King. We would all be so much better off if that had been the case.
But I wonder if the vote was held today after these comments surfaced, would J.D. Scholten have had a chance at winning? Like maybe Steve King would have still been able to pull it off because this kind of language is already baked into the cake. People know who this guy is. And I don't know if Iowa voters would be all that offended by this.
I don't know. I mean, remember the situation in Alabama where Doug Jones defeated Roy Moore, who was under the cloud of multiple sexual assault allegations, including of underage girls, and he only barely lost to Doug Jones. I kind of have a feeling that if you've been supporting Steve King for a while, you probably wouldn't be swayed to vote for a Democrat because of some offhanded comments about white nationalism.
Yeah, that's an unfortunate reality, but this is the country that we live in.
Let's talk about Russia and Ukraine. Russia's top security official has warned that neighboring Ukraine may no longer be a country soon, as the former Soviet republic is divided by competing interests. The unrest in Ukraine has gone back a really long time. I guess we could say this current incident or current set of conflicts go back to roughly 2014 when an uprising ousted the former Ukrainian president Viktor Yanukovych. And now we are actually hearing from Russian Security Council Secretary Nikolai Patrushev, who warned yesterday that the current strategy of the Ukrainian president could lead to a total end of the country of Ukraine. And of course, all of the language they use, Pat, is always couched to have some kind of double meaning where you can't just straight up say, these are direct threats, and we need to, if we care about a joint defense agreement with Ukraine, we need to activate around them. They're always slick enough and clever enough and smart enough to couch it in a way where maybe it's not a threat and it's simply an observation that this could lead to the self-destruction of Ukraine rather than anyone coming in and doing anything. But in the background, there's always these thinly veiled threats of aggression.
I think you still, though, have to take the comments seriously, especially in the wake of their annexation of Crimea in 2013, 2014. And the big concern is that Ukraine is not a part of NATO. So how would the international community respond to such a thing if they were to take over the entire country of Ukraine? Like if Russia had taken something else in the Soviet bloc, like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, because I think those are all three NATO countries, we would have an obligation to go to war with Russia. The same can't be said about Ukraine. And especially when you have a guy like Donald Trump in office, how would the U.S. handle such a thing?
Yeah, I mean, I might stop short of saying we would have an obligation to go to war with Russia, but we would be committed to participating in the joint defense of Ukraine if they were a NATO member. That kind of makes this more interesting, which is that, as Pat mentions, Ukraine is not a NATO member. So ultimately, that doesn't mean that NATO countries wouldn't participate in helping Ukraine, but it would mean that there's not this automatic defense that they've committed to. It would be a discussion, and they would have to make the decision as to, okay, what do we want to do about the Ukraine situation? And presumably they would want to be acting together. Of course, the wild card there is Donald Trump and his relationship with Vladimir Putin and how that would impact the U.S. decision. But in the midst of all this, you have a number of sources now saying that Donald Trump is still actively considering leaving NATO, which, again, it's a story in and of itself, but it's part of this policy that we've seen of being deferential to Russia in a way that kind of goes beyond logic and what we would expect to see an American president doing. And all these stories are related. I mean, still, I don't know if I've missed it, Pat, but I've still not seen any serious response by Trump or the United States to Russian aggression, Russian Navy aggression against Ukrainian Navy aggression, which we covered a few weeks ago, ramming a ship and taking a couple of sailors. I've still not seen Trump say a word about it.
No, in Trump's entire administration, pretty much every policy position that he's taken, pretty much every action that he's taken has been favorable to Russia. The only exception would be that time that he bombed that Syrian airbase where Russian planes were flying, but even then they got warning about that. And, you know, I hate to do this, but you have to start thinking about comparisons to World War II and Nazi Germany. Hitler slowly but surely took over land that was German-speaking, land that was historically German, like Sudetenland, Austria. Could you make that comparison to what Russia's doing with Ukraine, taking Crimea, and then threatening their ships and maybe wanting to take over the entire country eventually?
I don't know that I would be ready to make that comparison right now. And I think a key difference there, aside from just the language, is that, remember, NATO was signed after World War II. So a key difference, if we think about, okay, let's assume Putin gets away with everything in Ukraine, and then he wants to go further, pretty quickly he would start to butt up against NATO members. And even if Trump pulled the U.S. out of NATO, I mean, listen, anything can always happen, but I just don't see that it would be allowed to really go any further, although I could be depressingly wrong.
I really hope that you're right. I just worry that if there was ever a time for Putin to act, it would be now that he has a guy like Trump in the Oval Office in the United States.
Yeah, there's no question about that. If there were a time to pull antics like that, it probably would be right now. We talked a couple of weeks ago, or the week before, last week, I guess I would call it, the week before this one, also known as last week, about Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez floating the idea of a top marginal tax bracket of 70%. We broke down how marginal tax brackets work, how it could hypothetically work on income above 10 million, 50 million, whatever. You could set it wherever it is you think makes sense. There's now a new poll, the Hill-Harris X survey poll, conducted between January 12 and 13, after Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez made the call for that floated a 70% top marginal tax rate. 59% of registered voters support the idea of a 70% top marginal tax rate. Women support it by a slightly larger margin than men. Women support it 62 to 38. Men support it 55 to 45. And it is popular in all regions of the country. Southerners back it 57 to 43. Rural voters back it 56 to 44. So there are a lot of people in general, but particularly right-wingers, surprised by this level of support. And you really, the truth is, Pat, if you understand how marginal tax brackets work, it makes sense that this would have pretty significant support, because we're talking about, number one, a marginal tax bracket, not taking 70% of anyone's total income, but taxing income above a certain threshold at 70%, so that this is going to affect a very small percentage of the population, and it also is only going to affect part of their income. So this is another one of those examples of when you ask people, do you believe the government has a basic duty to provide some health care to everybody, even if they can't afford it? Most people say yes. You separate it from the politics. Similarly, this is another example of how Americans as voters would support far more progressive policies than that which our elected officials support.
I still, though, am quite surprised with the polling data. I would have thought that Republicans have over time won the argument when it comes to presenting the idea that this is, their money and you shouldn't have a right to it, and that rich people are job creators. It makes no sense for us to take more from them than we do from average citizens. And that, you as a commoner may one day become rich and be susceptible to having to pay the 70% tax rate, having to pay the estate tax. I always thought that they kind of won out on that, but this polling data suggests otherwise.
Well, I think both can be true, which is that were it not for that narrative, these numbers would be even more overwhelmingly in favor of the 70% marginal tax rate. In other words, instead of 59% of all Americans saying, yes, tax the top incomes at 70% marginal, you might have 69% or 79% or something like that. So I do think that it's been a successful narrative in many circles. That's why it's only 59% when many people would look at this from other countries and say, of course we should be doing that. Why not?
Yeah, and remember, Trump supporters, they talk about making America great again. It's often hard to pinpoint when they think America was so great, but when you do get an answer, it's usually around the 1950s, 1960s. And remember, under Eisenhower in the 1950s, the top marginal tax rate was something like 91%. Now, no one was actually paying that much because of the loopholes. And of course, these are just marginal tax rates. They're not effective. But if you think that was such a great time, maybe we should go back to that. Maybe you should be happy that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is only suggesting 70% and not 91%.
I agree with you. Now, they already have a talking point. They say that everything was completely different during the times of high marginal tax rates and high growth, that the situation then in the United States was not analogous to the situation now. Whether we agree with that or not would require further exploration. While I agree with you, Pat, they already have a talking point in place to refute that one.
Yeah.
Send me your thoughts about where do you think 70% should start? Should it be above $510,000, which is currently the top tax bracket? Should it be on incomes above $1 million, 10 million, 20 million? Where would you like to see 70% become the marginal tax bracket? We'll follow up if we get good data from our bonus show audience.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.